All right, everybody, we'll get started. Come on up. Dr. Seymour was going to make an announcement.
Well, some of you have already heard the news, but Megan Wally joined our team a little over 5 years ago, and over that time, she's taken on many roles. She's project director and co-director of our CDC-funded opioid work. She leads the incredible registry team that launched AJRR for our system, as well as all of the other internal registries. She is now co-PI with Natty Hammett and Daniel Lease on the Duke Endowment-funded Core 2.0. And this week, she defended her dissertation and is officially Dr. Wally. So please join me in congratulating Megan Wally on this incredible accomplishment and in welcoming her to our faculty as an assistant professor.
And Dr. Wally, if you're on virtually, congratulations. So today we are a little overdue on having Dr. Schmitz here. So 2 years ago, Dr. Geary, who's now one of our hand fellows, had written a grant through JBJS Journal Club. And Matt Schmitz, Dr. Schmitz is our visiting professor that we had planned to bring in a little over a year ago. So we've had to delay this a few times, but Matt's a graduate of the U.S. Air Force Academy and currently a lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Air Force. Currently lives in San Antonio. He did his residency there as well, and then his fellowship in San Diego at Rady Children's just the year prior to me being there with one of our previous graduates, Dr. Chris Bray. Dr. Schmitz is currently the chair of the Department of Orthopaedics and chief of the Pediatric Orthopedic Service, as well as the Young Adult Hip Preservation Service. He's been team physician for USA Rugby for maybe a little over 8 years now, and has been incredibly active through POSNA as well as the Academy on numerous national committees. I've had the pleasure to get to know Matt over the years just through our careers in Peds Ortho, and an opportunity that he gave me to go with him to Ecuador through a group that he works with mission work with Project Perfect World. So Dr. Schmitz, thanks for being here. I'm excited to have you here and look forward to your talk today on social media. Our CME color will be blue.
Well, hello, and thank you very much. I'm honored to be here. Thanks for that introduction, Brian. So these are my disclosures. Maybe. And normally I say that there's nothing kind of pertinent to the lecture, but as Dr. Scannell mentioned, this was funded by a grant from JBJS, and I do serve as the deputy editor of social media for JBJS, but this isn't going to be a big ad for JBJS. We can talk offline later if you want to know about some of their different activities. So, this is what we'll kind of go through today on what is social media. I assume everyone in the room has a social media account, why use it, the different styles, some research out of orthopedics and other fields that show that maybe using social media can help grow your practice and maybe even help grow some of your research, and then some of the benefits and potential downsides to it. So my background, I grew up in Colorado. I went down to the Air Force Academy to play football, which is probably not the right reason to attend a service academy, as I realized at the tail end of my freshman year when I was like the 7th left outside linebacker and miserable. And so I transitioned over to rugby, which led to a bunch of other potential opportunities in my life. And then went to Chicago for medical school, went down to San Antonio for my residency. Back then it was 2 separate hospitals. There was Wilford Hall was the Air Force Hospital, and Brooke Army Medical Center was the Army Hospital. I then was a general orthopedic surgeon for 2 years before I went and did fellowship and came back to San Antonio. And during that time I was gone, the Air Force and the Army Hospital merged into one conglomeration called San Antonio Military Medical Center. Social media for me started off as posting pictures of my daughters so that my mom and dad could see them because they were still back in Colorado. And then it's kind of grown over time where I started incorporating it into my practice. And next thing you know, you've got requests from JBJS and POSNA, and now even AOA, which is maybe a little bit slower into the game has formed a social media committee, and I'm helping lead up one of their committees on that. So it's kind of been fun to watch how this has grown over the years. You know, does anyone in this room not have a social media account? We have a few folks, some holdouts. So, you know what, social media is online tools that allow swift sharing of content. These are the various ones that you can use. Primarily LinkedIn is used professionally. I do have a TikTok account, but I have never posted. It's only to monitor my 13 and 11-year-old daughter's TikTok accounts. But primarily what we're talking about is the use of things like Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and Twitter. You know, why use it is we'll go through each of these. It's free marketing. It can be used for social branding. It can use to make connections, and also is frequently being used for education. With regards to the marketing, you know, it can be your practice. It can be you as an individual, what your niche is. We know that patients are frequently searching out search engines to look for their physicians and surgeons, and social media is one way that they interact. And we'll get into some of that depending on what your patient base is, whether or not to have a Facebook account that's your kind of face forward versus Twitter, because it depends. If you're an arthroplasty surgeon, the prototypical user of Facebook is a little bit older than Instagram or Twitter, which would be more used in sports. But you know, even Medscape shows here one of the top 20 media social influencers is Howard Lukes, who's an orthopedic surgeon and uses it for educational videos, et cetera. So it can be incorporated to teach your patients, or the way we used to just use web handouts or web-based handouts to educate our patients. It can also be used for branding, name recognition for you or your department. And this can lead to invitations and opportunities, which is one of the reasons that I'm here today. And we know that residency programs and fellowships are frequently using this. So, you know, as the chair in orthopedics at my hospital, one of my leadership visions is to try and rise we have a lot of junior surgeons, and we're a little bit unique in a sense that when we hire a surgeon or they come to work for us, we know they have an expiration date. You age out of the military, usually at 20 years. And so what I view our mission is to try and elevate what they are able to do to set them up for their second career. A great example would be like Dr. Joe Shu, who served a great career in the Army and then was able to come here to a great opportunity. So what can we do in San Antonio to make sure that our young surgeons, as they age out or move on to their next career, are successful? And the way that I look at that is trying to highlight the good work that they do. And we can do that through social media. So highlighting some of the fantastic work that's been done over the years. And this came up recently when we were able to use an opportunity where Alex Smith came down to our center for the CFI, our rehab center, and essentially was coming down. And you've got to understand that the military is a very risk-averse type of environment. So when Alex came down and he had the ESPN cameras with him, our public affairs department was nervous. They did not want anything bad to happen. And so the very first one was an E60 that came out, and it was pretty well received. And that led to a Fox NFL Sunday. And next thing you know, we're on 60 Minutes talking about it. And the public affairs office suddenly looks and goes, well, this is actually bringing good press to our place. And then that leads to the public affairs office wants to do something when we did our 100th PAO and with a cake, right? And so all this comes from doing good work and highlighting what your folks have done for you. The CFI has been around for about 15 years. We didn't invent anything new. It was just highlighting all the good work that our surgeons were doing. And so social media can have that impact, whether it's with your hospital system or with your practice. It can lead to connections. It can cultivate friendships through different groups, group activities. This is a Peloton group that gets together and has rides together that are all orthopedic surgeons. I was at the NOLC last week in Washington, D.C. and having a drink with a friend when a guy walked up to me and commented on my Twitter things regarding vaccination. And it was someone that I'd never met before, but I looked at him, I said, oh, you're Shoulder Doc Navarro from Twitter. So it leads to these friendships that you may not necessarily have. And it's a way to keep up with your alumni or your mentors. I frequently am looking for what our graduates are doing now as they've moved into their second careers in the civilian sector and highlighting the great opportunities that that they're participating in. And this was recently shown in a JBJS orthopedic forum that shows that social media can foster that connectedness that maybe we've gotten away from as we've had to do a lot more virtual and less in-person meetings over the last 18 months. So, this article came out earlier this year in the Orthopedic Forum, and it really was an editorial looking at how it can promote and share research ideas, which I think is one of the things that one of the frontiers of Twitter or social media that can be used for. It can foster more inclusive conversations, and there are varying approaches, and this is evolving. This has changed over the last 3 years. I expect it to continue to change over the next 5 to 7 years. You can use it for education. You can get advice on cases. There's some fantastic accounts out there that are both personal accounts and anonymous accounts that give tips and tricks on trauma cases, and educate others on problems that they've had in the OR. As we go through residency, you learn all the proper ways to do things, but one of the things that we frequently don't learn is how to get out of trouble and how to avoid trouble. And so you can read a book chapter or watch a video on how to do a periacetabular osteotomy, but what happens in the OR in real time when something goes wrong? And so Twitter can be a way that and social media in general can be a way to share some of those tips and tricks on how to stay out of trouble. Almost like many fellowships have listservs. In our fellowship, it's a group text message where we share cases back and forth and trying to, hey, what would you do with this? Well, you can do that on Twitter, but I will caution you, and we'll get into some of the potential pitfalls, is you've got to be very careful about PII and not violating patients' rights. So it is used frequently for education. So what are the different styles of use? You can have anonymous versus personal accounts, and anonymous accounts, there's some funny ones out there. There's good TikTok accounts where they're associated with a name, but not necessarily a person. These are two lovely lady interlocks that talks a lot about trauma. And then Neanderthal, who is actually a Navy surgeon, he has kind of morphed his over from an anonymous account to actually knowing who he is, but he's a total joint surgeon who actually serves on the AAOS social media committee. And so these groups have massive followings of 17,000 followers he has compared to my 2,000 on Twitter. But it's a little bit of satire, a little bit of political commentary that maybe can protect you from a personal account. Frequently groups, teams of 5 or 6 surgeons will have a group account that they share that's anonymous. And it can serve as a form of release. Versus the way I use social media, which is personal, and it's a combination of both medical and personal. This is my Instagram from a screenshot from last night. That's a little bit of combo of recognition and then my daughter playing volleyball. So that's kind of how I use it. But you got to be mindful of what you're posting. And I'll say this over and over again: is you need to consider future employment and assume your boss is always watching. One of the take homes I got was assume that your boss has an anonymous account and is following you, but you don't know which anonymous account they are. So you've always got to be mindful of what you're potentially posting so that you're not getting in trouble. But you can use it for a little bit of humor. This was from the Baltimore City Health Department when people were kind of pushing back against the viruses, and they had a great ad campaign, and you can share that on your page. So, being a grand rounds, let's get into some of the data, because there is some early research over the last couple of years. This is an article from a couple of years ago. Who should you be following? The top 100 social media influencers. I am not one of the top 100. But what you'll see is that in orthopedic surgery, it's predominantly sports surgeons, and it's predominantly sports surgeons in private practice. There's a handful of other folks in there, including therapists, et cetera. But in this article, it was interesting. They looked at those influencers, and then they looked at their H index. And I don't know if everyone knows what an H index is, but it's a way to kind of describe someone's productivity within the research realm. So an H index is essentially if you've published 10 papers that have been cited 10 times, you have an H index of 10. So it gives a little bit more weight to things that are cited more frequently. So as opposed to publishing 1,000 case reports that have never been cited, if you've got 20 articles that have been published 20 times, then you have an H index of 20. And what they looked at in this is that they found that the social media influencers, those top 100, had an H index of 13. JBJS had an article in 2016 that showed that the average academic faculty had an H-index of 5, meaning they published at least 5 articles that had been cited 5 times. And most academic chairs had an H-index of 13. So even though these private practice sports surgeons that were considered in the top 100 influencers on Twitter, they had an H-index of 13 as well, which shows there may be a potential link between social media activity and the research that you're producing. Maybe it increases your citations in the research. That was looked at in JOUS Global earlier this year. They looked at 835 articles from 2018 to 2019 and looked at both citations and the Twitter activity. What made sense in this article is that the publications that came out earlier, so those earlier 2018 articles, had more citations. That makes inherent sense. The older an article is, the more times it has to be cited. But there was a weak but positive correlation between citations and the social media activity. What I found interesting is what's shown here on the right is that these weren't actually author tweets. These were other people tweeting about those articles. And so early research suggests that there's potentially some benefit into increasing your citations. Again, this was a Journal of Hand Surgery that looked at articles in 6 hand journals from 2017 and showed a modest increase of 4% in citations on those with higher rates of social media activity. But what was more predictive was which journal they were actually published in. So the Journal of Hand Surgery had the highest amount of citations. This has been shown in other fields as well. So urology looked at 213 articles, and 73% of those articles had a Twitter mention associated with them, and found that there was a 2-fold increase in Scopus citation, which was significant, and a 2.3 increase in Google Scholar citation. So there is this concept that Twitter activity or social media activity may be an indicator of future citation. One of the ways that you can look at influence with regards to social media is called an altmetric attention score. And I'll show you kind of what it's a weighted base based on whether it gets a Facebook post or a Twitter post. And when there's been some research, this is from the Journal of Arthroscopy, where they looked at orthopedic RCTs in 5 high impact journals. So New England Journal, Lancet, JAMA, and then both Annals and Archives of Internal Medicine. And they compared orthopedic trials versus non-orthopedic trials from 2011 to 2016. They found that the altimetric scores were significantly higher for the ortho RCTs, but there really was no difference in the number of citations. And so although they did find a link between those AAS scores and citations, there was no difference between the ortho and non-ortho. So does this mean that we're good at promoting our own brand, or does it mean that our randomized controlled trials in these predominantly medical journals are more quote unquote interesting to the general public? And it's probably a mixture of both. It's the interest in the common musculoskeletal complaints is high from both our patients and from our medical colleagues. And this again shows on the left here that the length with the number of tweets and Facebook mentions higher, and citations in both groups significantly higher. What about infographics? Infographics or visual abstracts are kind of a way to package an article that are specifically meant for social media. It puts all the highlights of an article in a single one picture that you can send out via Twitter, Instagram, et cetera. And most journals are using this now. So on the left is a copy of one from Journal of Arthroscopy. On the right is JBJS, and either call them VAs, visual abstracts, or infographics. And what in arthroscopy, and this is that altimetric attention score here that shows that various things. So a Wikipedia mention is weighted higher. If it makes a news article, it's weighted higher than your baseline 1.0, which is a Twitter mention. And so using the infographics from 2019 in arthroscopy, they matched those 1 to 4 with original research articles and found that they had higher AAS scores, but really no change in the citations. Now, the downside of this is that these are articles from 2019, so maybe haven't been in press long enough to start earning multiple citations, but does show that the infographics, that visual representation, seems to be associated with higher activity on the receiver side. Journal of Arthroplasty did the same thing, where they did a randomized controlled trial with 20 articles that were randomized to either a visual abstract or a plain text social media tweet that went out on the day that the article was published. They then crossed those over 30 days later and found that there was significantly more interaction for the visual abstracts. So there was more tweeting activity, more social media activity. But what was interesting in this article is that there was actually higher clicks for people to go and open the article with the visual abstracts. So it's not simply generating some talk about it. This is generating folks to actually go in and read the article. So it's an interesting concept. And is that going to lead to increased citations down the road? What about fellowship and residency programs? This was an article from JBJS, and it was an AOA issue. They looked in May of 2019 and compared to over 18 months later, November of 2020, and found that out of the 164 residency and fellowship programs, the number of accounts jumped massively from 76 to 239. And so there's marked increases in different programs using social media. And we were talking a little bit about this last night, Brian and I were, is that the medical students are using that to look at different residency programs. So at our place, we started a Twitter account and an Instagram account that we try to have the residents run, because it's almost like a med student recruitment tool at this point. They want to see what your residents are doing, both inside the hospital and outside the hospital. Students are looking for some of that work-life balance to see if they're potentially joining a cohesive team. And this is a way to kind of advertise that. So, and then also patient reported factors. So this was at a journal, Shoulder and Elbow Surgery, and they found that the amount of social media activity from shoulder and elbow surgeons was directly linked to patient reviews as well. Now, you can consider whether this is a good thing or a bad thing, but what they found over time is that obviously folks that are younger in practice are significantly more involved in social media than those that are older in practice, but found that those patients tended to have higher content on the internet, and then therefore interaction with their patients as well. So you can argue this is a good thing, but it's been highlighted in a couple of recent articles. So some concepts of how do you develop, or how do you incorporate this into your practice? You know, where is the time? What is your routine? And some caution on intruding on family time. And so, you know, you have to, if you're going to incorporate social media in your practice, you have to do it based on what your time schedule allows. The way I've incorporated that is during the 45 minutes of soccer warm up before my daughter starts her game. There's very few things you can have idle chit chat with some of the other parents, or you can post some social media things. So there's that. There's when you're at an all day volleyball tournament and you have 2 hours in between games, you can use that time. You can use it in between OR cases when you're at an academic institution like mine that seems to have about an hour and a half turnover time between every case. And these are some of the times that you can use it. But you got to be cautious that you don't want to have it intrude on your family time, that you shouldn't be doing it at the dinner table when you can be talking about your day with your family. So how do you grow your social media presence? The two things are content and engagement. And so putting content out and then engaging folks that reply or respond to your content. Sometimes there's a little bit of luck. This was a tweet I sent out from Dan Rather, had a pretty good op-ed talking about the pandemic and the frustration that medical workers are having. And he retweeted it. And then within like a day, it had 500,000 impressions and 1,000 people following me. But it also led to what we'll talk about at the end, is that there are people that are going to argue with you no matter what. And so it leads to some vitriol as well. So a little bit of luck doesn't hurt either. I don't know anything about the payment model or scheduling apps. You can pay, and some practices do this. They pay to kind of promote almost like an advertisement. And then some big groups like JBJS uses a company called Hootsuite, where they can actually schedule so you can sit down and type in 15 tweets and then schedule when those are going to come out at regular intervals. I don't have experience with that. I don't think that's probably for individual users, but if there's a practice or a group that's using it, that may be beneficial. So, you know, what are the potential benefits? That it can get you involved with groups that you wouldn't have otherwise necessarily known. AOA meeting was in San Diego a couple of years back, and we had an opportunity to present some of the work that we've done with diversity at our program, and met with Christy Weber, who was president at the time, and Jenny Green was president of the Australian Orthopaedics Association. And it led to a conversation afterwards, which led to us kind of following each other in social media. And out of that formed this group called the International Orthopedic Diversity Alliance, which has folks from all over the world that are specifically geared towards promoting diversity within orthopedics. A group like that with members in Hong Kong, in England, and Australia, and New Zealand would never have formed if there weren't social media opportunities for us to interact, because we simply never would be in the same room together. So it's a way to learn from others, but also you can learn from leadership styles and leadership development as well. And a lot of this can be done through different hashtags, depending on what your interest is, and again, that social engagement. What are the pitfalls or downsides? You need to be careful, right? Twitter put this out: don't drink and tweet, because the last thing you want to do is do something that could potentially be harmful to you or your practice down the road. And so I tell folks that the interwebs are forever. People can take screenshots, you can delete a tweet, but it's out there forever. So someone is always watching, whether it's your current employment, potential future employment. I did some legal work recently, and in defense of a dentist, actually, and I was meeting with the lawyers, and they had combed through my Twitter page and had gotten on me about some of the practice involvement things. And their first comment was, your Twitter page is really boring. I said, yes, it's mostly medical stuff, but be mindful that people are going to go through and look through that. And so be prepared to defend yourself as well. I'd say caution with multiple accounts. So as I've gotten involved with different groups, our residency, JBJS, SOMOS, which is our Society of Military Orthopedic Surgeons, and also IOTA, I have the keys to those Twitter accounts. And so on your social media, you can kind of thumb through, depends which one you're posting as. So you got to be very careful as you're toggling between these groups, what you like and what you retweet. JBJS has 33,000 followers. So I don't want to be tweeting out anything that might be a little bit controversial to their 33,000 followers. So just be careful. It's a word of caution. And then social media can be a deep, dark hole that you don't necessarily want to go down. There is always someone that's going to argue with you. And it's usually from an anonymous account. And you could spend all day trying to defend your statement about vaccinations, et cetera. It can be very polarizing, but just understand that you are never going to win those nameless and faceless internet arguments. Someone's always going to be mean to you. So be careful going down. So I like to kind of poke the bear every once in a while on Facebook or Instagram and generate some comments. So, which platform to use kind of depends on what your style is, what your preference is. As I mentioned, I started off with Facebook simply as a way to keep my parents informed about my kids. That's morphed, and I use Twitter now more for orthopedics type activities. LinkedIn is more of a professional based one that people used for social networking with regards to looking for jobs, et cetera. The good thing, Instagram and Facebook are linked, and so you can post pictures and have them go straight to your account, and you can set that up where you have either, and we talked a little bit about this last night, having a personal account versus a professional account. And so you can have a professional account where you simply just talk about what your practice is as an arthroplasty surgeon or a shoulder and elbow surgeon, and then link that up between different aspects, and understand again that your patient population dictates some of that too. If you're an arthroplasty surgeon, maybe not the best to have a Twitter account, because if you look at the demographics of Twitter users, they're typically pre-arthritis. And so maybe better to have a Facebook account. So in conclusion, social media is here and present. I think it can be a useful tool if you want to incorporate it in your practice for engagement, for education, for collaboration. You need to be careful and be mindful, but dive in. The water's fine. And I know that there's folks online. And so this last was for Joe Shue. I don't know if he knows what this is. This is the Commanders in Chief Trophy. So this goes to the annual winner of Air Force, Army, and Navy. And Joe will probably tell you that Army's won it 3 times out of the last 4 years. But when I was at the Air Force Academy, I thought it lived in our locker room because we won it all 4 years. So, Air Force has won it 20 times and Army's won it 9 times. So go Air Force and beat Army. So thanks for having me today. I'd be happy to talk about any questions about personal use versus professional use, or any questions that folks have on social media.
Any questions for Dr. Schmitz?
Thanks, Matt. That was great and very, hits home for many of us in here. My first question, you mentioned the negative Nellies on all these platforms who are going to come after you no matter what. What is your recommendation for how to handle those? Do you completely ignore it? Do you say, thanks for your opinion? I mean, I think your slide about poking the bear is interesting, because if you're really looking to sort of make news, so say it's an anti-vaxxing thing you're passionate about, if you engage a few of those, it's actually going to get more play. So there can be a positive effect from that negative interaction.
Yeah, you're totally right. So it depends what your personality is. If you like to argue with people, sometimes it's a little bit fun to do that. And I've done that, but you've got to be careful, right? So I've done it when I was on vacation, right? I'm not going to be in between cases arguing with people on the internet, but if it's something that you do because you enjoy a little bit, then I think that's fun. And I've done that on some of my pages with regards to vaccination. But you can present data and then people just say that you're in the pocket of big pharma and vaccinations. That's their response. And I was like, I wish, so, I mean, I really think that, yeah. But I think it depends on whether or not you enjoy that or you want, and you can use that to further educate people, which is what I was doing with trying to present some data about it. But no matter what data you present, there's going to be another account that comes in and says, you're a liar, you're making this up. And we talked about how our hospital was shut down to elective surgeries and people said that was not true. Well, the reason I'm on a Monday not in the operating room is because our ORs are shut down. So I think it depends on if you like that stuff, you can. You just got to be careful that you don't want it to kind of take over your personal life, essentially.
You talked about shutting it down at home. So what are some tips and tricks that you use at home, just when you walk in the door, and how you manage kind of the social media and everything else work related, and then invest in that time into your girls and wife?
Yeah, you can turn off notifications for it. You can put your phone away, but we're always getting called or texted about a patient. And so you can turn off notifications or you can just ignore them. My big thing is we've got a strict rule at our house that there's no phones at the dinner table. My daughters are 13 and 11, so they both have phones, and they're involved in texting and FaceTiming their friends. And so a couple of years ago, we said, that's a rule at our house is we don't get to eat dinner together every night, but when we do, there's no phones at the table. So is it okay? Just like you text when you're watching a movie, can you do a little bit? I just don't do it while we're sitting on the couch having family time. That's my rule. And so again, everyone's different on how you incorporate that, but I think it's really important. We all work a lot. And so the time that you have with your family, in my opinion, is really important. And so that's kind of how I've made the rules in our house.
So we do the same thing, and we kind of, I don't know if you ever went through the team steps training where you try and empower everybody in the room. So we did that in our house, and everybody can call anybody else out on use of their phone. Yeah. So it gets entertaining at times. It's like, oh, you.
Yeah, dad. And I'm like, wait, I've got to return. This is about my patient. I've got to return this text message. Dad, you said there's no phones at the table.
Matt, thanks for a great talk. And back to the academic stuff for just a minute. Do you think there's going to be a point where this will factor into the H-index or impact factors for journals mentioned on social media? Or how do you see that evolving over time?
I think it probably is. If you go to JBJS or some of your other ones, they will list what your AAS is linked to the article. So I think at some point it is. At the same time, 20 years ago, we said that maybe writing book chapters would help productivity as well. And we still don't get any credit for writing book chapters, right? So it may be something else that we look at, right? It may not factor into H-index, but it may be that when you pull up someone's research profile, their H-index, their number of citations, and you may get a score with relation to your AAS. So kind of separate, but still observed. But I think it's interesting that there is some early data that suggests that it increases your citations. I think that we need, again, this is kind of blown up over the last 5 years. We need to look at that and see if it really does affect it. What I found most interesting was the fact that there seems to be more people opening articles based on social media, which inherently you'd think would lead to further citations down the road. But that hasn't necessarily been borne out yet.
So that's a question I've had about, usually most articles aren't open access. So you technically can't tweet your PDF. It's illegal. So specifically with JBJS, what steps have they taken to, it would seem like for a journal standpoint, it would actually improve your readership if people could do that. Has there been any discussion about allowing that, or is it still just only open access? You
Yeah.
can tweet the abstract and that's it.
So we've got our fall meeting next week, and I know this will be discussed because I have to discuss some of it. But so one of the things they've done is the infographics. The danger with that is you can always read an abstract, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you get the full emphasis of the article or the potential downsides of the article by just reading the abstract. So there's this kind of balance between, the journals are still in a money-making concept. And so you can't open everything up. So what they've done is open some of them up. They have a JBJS open access as well. That's free. And so some of those AOA critical issues have moved over into the open access because, again, that's some more op-ed stuff, but things on leadership, they want to have further reach. And so it's not behind a paywall. So I think that's always going to be a debate and is going to be an argument with the publishing company that still is trying to make a dollar.
Hi, if I could, this is Kevin Burrows. I've just enjoyed your talk. I was going to ask too, when you were talking about these, as far as for dispensing the literature, et cetera, things like ResearchGate, other ones where people will, contact you and ask you about getting a printed copy of your article. Are there any of those that you have or that you have any experience with, and what's okay, what's not okay kind of situation?
Yeah, I have had folks reach out to me to ask for some of my articles. It's kind of probably like when Netflix first came around and you get the DVDs mailed to you, and then some of us maybe burned those DVDs and kept them on our own, and it's probably illegal. But I have shared my research articles with folks, and so I think that especially if you're promoting what your team is doing, and there's a reason that they put who the corresponding author is so that people can reach out with questions. So my Matt Schmitz hat says share it. If someone is interested in your research, share it. The JBJS folks may not like that, but if it's your article, I think it's fine. With IOTA, with our diversity group, we put out a quarterly newsletter, and we're trying to include some articles related to diversity. And we've run into that issue as well, where they're behind a paywall. So we're just including the abstracts because you don't want to anger the publishing company, et cetera. So I'm sure that technically you're not supposed to share that widely and not put your full PDF, which I don't think you can't put your full PDF on the tweets anyway, but you can share the abstract. And if someone takes the time to reach out to you with an email, I've shared my personal articles with them.
Really appreciate your talk, Dr. Schmitz. I'm one of the PGY2s. I'm Verge. I have a social media kind of professional page. And as a new PGY2, like everything I do is really cool. So I often find myself like wanting to post about cases. I'm like, man, this is great. Like somebody wants to see this, I haven't really gotten to do it yet because I think one of the things about social media is that's kind of plus or minus for people is posting about patients and specific case examples and, worrying about HIPAA and things like that. Is there anything you do in particular or things you've seen as far as posting and that kind of education from that standpoint?
Yeah, so that's a great topic to talk about is some of my sports colleagues will post pretty in-depth pictures of osteochondral allografts and things like that. And what they've done and what I've incorporated is that you get a special consent form from the patients. That's just a general consent form saying that you're not going to use names or faces, but pictures from your surgery may be used for talks or used for social media purposes. I think you've got to be really careful with, especially as a resident, with unique cases that could be identifiable. So all of my hip patients get enrolled in a registry through Anchor. That's a research arm that we're doing. And as part of that, I talk to them and say that we may use some of your intraoperative photos or x-rays, de-identified x-rays for talks or for social media. So there are ways you can protect yourself with that. And that's something that you have to decide as you kind of grow into your practice and as you use that page as your kind of forward-facing marketing 4, 5, 6 years from now. But I do know a bunch of folks that have specific social media consent forms. And then if you talk with the patients and you say, it's not going to be your face on there, it's going to be what the inside of your knee looks like, then I haven't had anyone that said, no, I don't want to be a part of that.
So that's a really interesting concept to sort of tag on to, because I think behind that is also depends on who you work for.
Right.
So your hospital system may have their own policies on it and whether things are recorded in the hospital and how things are done. So I would sort of pay attention to that. So which leads into my question for you on that is, you know, you sort of hinted at the same thing when someone just asked you about sharing articles. So sharing articles is technically illegal, but it is probably a good collaborative thing to do in many situations. So there is probably, I mean, I think if we went through pictures posted from the average medical center, there is probably 75% that if you asked a lawyer to look at them are not legal.
Right.
But if you don't, you know, if you use common sense and judgment and, you know, de-identify things, blur things out so you can't even actually see what's going on truthfully. I mean, I think those are potentially some ways. Any other comments or thoughts on that?
Yeah.
I think there's a division between what's appropriate and what's technically legal.
Right. And you're very right. It depends on what your hospital system and even different hospitals within that system will have different rules. When we were at Rady's, there was a strict rule of no pictures taken because somebody had gotten in trouble for taking inappropriate pictures in a children's hospital. It was 2 years before, but it was like one of the janitorial staff or something had done something, and so there was a very strict rule that you could not take personal photos within. We have med photo at the ready and available, and so I gave a talk a few weeks ago. It was a talk on PAOs and it was a video technique. And so we had the patient sign a consent form that we were going to use some videos from the surgery for a lecture. And we had med photo come. That's not something that I would have my scrub tech or OR nurse take on my iPhone. That's something where you bring formal med photo in and there's a consent form for it. But you're totally right. It depends on what your hospital policy is, what exactly is being taken. And so you need to be careful and be mindful. And that's a lot of this. I do think there's going to be more guidance the further we get into it because it's relatively new. And so you have to be careful. I can't say that enough, is to be careful with some of it.
Like one comment, I think from a resident perspective, you know, and similar for me too, you know, I want to post those cool things that we're doing and seeing. Atrium's got a pretty strong policy and they're actually working to strengthen that policy actively right now, especially with a lot of the resident accounts and certainly with your own personal ones too. So I have just aired from the cool things that I want to show, usually not showing them, has been typically where I've aired. I think it's just keeps you out of trouble.
Hi, I'm Mona Lisa. I'm a visiting student from Case Western in Cleveland here for the month. I have a question on how you incorporate your family into your social media. I acknowledge that that's a way to kind of connect with your patients for them to see who you are outside of the hospital, but how do you approach that with your kids and respecting their autonomy in the internet space? Because there are some schools of thought that's like, you shouldn't be on there. It's a completely separate thing. So how do you involve them in the process?
Yeah, that's a great question. And some people totally divorce those and have just a professional page that's separate from their personal page. And I just have chosen not to. So talking about the team steps, and my daughters have to approve any picture of them that goes on the internet, right? They are strict. Dad, take that off. I don't like the way I look in that one. And so I involve them. And so Kaylee, my oldest, has a Instagram account. They both have TikTok. And so I think incorporating them, and then as they get older, that's going to continue to be important to have those conversations. The easiest way to do that is to completely separate those and have your private personal account versus your open professional account. And so, family photos and things like that, there are people that do have real concerns about that. I just have a little bit different viewpoint on it.
Any other comments online?
Matt, it's Joe Shu,
Hey, Joe.
Pete Air Force. So, sorry I'm not there in person, where our translational basic science team are headed up to Wake to work on one of our studies. My question is, some specialties have actually used social media, specifically Twitter, to do direct to social media publication of scientific content rather than the traditional peer review print journals, and have used sort of the Amazon style approach where the peer review is going to be in the social media space. Do you see that as something, I think you'll have a unique perspective on this, not only from the social media perspective, but being one of the deputy editors of a more traditional journal. Is that something that you think is going to come to orthopedics, or what are your feelings, and then put on your JBGS hat? What's the, I'm sure there's been discussions around that stuff at JBGS, Beat Air Force.
Yeah, Joe, that's a good point. I'm a firm believer in the peer review process. I think that we are going to see some of that Amazon type style. And the downside of that is then it's incumbent on the reader to interpret that. And I like the fact that, especially within the education realm, that it's gone through a peer review process before it's put out to the reader. We're seeing this now with even some of our societies have lectures that go through a peer review process before they're placed online, to give it that extra step before it goes out to the general membership. Putting on my JBJS hat, there are certain journals out there that kind of self-cite, meaning they'll have an editorial that talks specifically about the article, and it can impact increase your impact factor, almost inflated a little bit. And so the JBJS is very old school and traditional, that they refuse to do that. I brought it up at a meeting a couple of years ago and was quickly chastised about it. And so I think that you are going to see some groups move into that realm, but I still think that the core and JBJS and some of the more traditional journals within orthopedics are going to stay with their current format, because it's worked for over 100 years and has been successful. Does that answer the question?
It does. Thanks a lot. Beat Air Force.
All right, Matt,
November 6th.
one last question for you that I don't think we've hit on at all here. So I had never thought about this personally, but we had a plan or a proposal presented to the AOA board, asking us to kind of endorse a social media sort of platform, I guess, whatever you want to describe it as. And one of the things that everybody did, first thing they did was people started going through, who does that account follow?
Mm-hmm.
And actually, one of the primary reasons that they chose not to endorse or sort of go with that was because of who that person was following, because it was sort of a random, it was a medical account, but it's following People Magazine and Maxim Magazine and like all these other things. So any comments on that? Have you had any experience with that, or in negative or positive?
Yeah, I have. So POSNA formed a social media group, and one of my mentees was kind of heading it up, and he asked me to participate, and he was looking for who should we invite to be on this. And I gave him a couple of names, and he said, yeah, I thought about that person, but I'm not really sure we want that person to be involved based on their political and how kind of outspoken that person was. So again, I think that who you follow, and that's what I was kind of hinting at with, depending on which account you're toggling back and forth with, you've got to be careful what you like and who you follow, because that is, people look at that and they look at what you're involved in. And so if you ask that person, they're not going to change their political views, or they're not going to be any less outspoken because he or she believes in that. But that may close some doors for you if you're very outspoken about and controversial about something. So I think that that's just like in a non-social media world, you invite speakers, and if you know someone's going to be controversial, you maybe shy away from inviting that speaker. So I think it's going to play out the same way.
I think it's a really good point, and it's maybe a reason to have multiple accounts. So if you want to have something that you use for leisure reading versus something professional,
Right.
That's a real, potential good use for that second account to kind of do that. I was fascinated by how impactful who you follow portion of things were.
Right.
So, all right. Well, thank you on behalf of all of us here in Charlotte. Thank you very much for coming and presenting. We
Thanks for
enjoyed it.
having me.
We're going to take a couple minute break and then we're going to do some cases.